Perfect. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Nope, not that screen. Where do you go now? Hold on 1 second. Sorry about that. We have a few more people that just joined. That's awesome. Perfect. That's better.
Yeah, it looks great.
All right. Let me see if I can pull up my participants. All right. We'll give it maybe like another 30 seconds. What do y'all think?
Yeah, that's fine.
Let's do it.
I'm just going to pull up the chat here so I can have it ready to go. All right, why don't we get started? All right, welcome everyone to the second course of the PR workshop that we're hosting with our friends at W2 Communications. The first course was amazing. We've had great feedback, tons of great content, and really some nice chats and questions that came from the attendees. So I was excited to see that. I can't wait to dive into this next one. If you all can see my slides, now it's all about executing that strategy. So what does it take from A to Z? And so today our professors are both Tom, Rezo, and Christine. And yeah, I'll give the mic to you. And if you want to do just a quick introduction, and let's dive right in.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Maria. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As Maria said, last week we learned about setting the foundation and the beginnings of your cybersecurity PR strategy, and now we're talking about executing. So go to the next slide. We have an agenda here, just kind of everything we're going to cover. Just like last week, we'd like this to be interactive. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'd love to have a conversation. I know a lot of questions may come up during this, so I definitely want to make sure this is useful and informative for everybody. And so for our introduction, we'll do a quick introduction here on the next slide. But you have myself. My name is Christine Blake. I'm a vice president at W2. Been at the company almost 10 years, experience along different lines of communication programs across different technologies, but especially cybersecurity. Most notable for this course is the fact that I'm the host of our podcast, Inside the Media Minds. So on that podcast, I have the pleasure of interviewing reporters from across the industry, different verticals, all different types of tiers of publications. And I'm able to get kind of the inside scoop on what they're covering, the person behind the byline. I actually just did our 51st episode this morning with a reporter from Security Magazine. He's based in the UK. And it was a really helpful conversation, but love for you guys to check that out. Happy to answer any questions about it, but a lot of the insight that we have comes a lot from this podcast. So I'll let Tom do a quick intro to himself as well.
Hey, great to meet everyone. So Tom Resaw, Senior Vice President here at W2 Communications. I've been in technology PR almost entirely focused on cybersecurity for many, many years. The first data breach that blew up my family's dinner plans was, I think, maybe the I love you worm, like the late 90s. That's back when people got excited about something that would just email everybody in your contact list. So it's kind of funny to trade stories like that, because cybersecurity, obviously a much bigger issue across so many more news cycles and circumstances today. But as we're going to show you, a lot of the same principles hold true in terms of how do you articulate your message and get in front of the people covering those different areas of impact. I've worked for companies that have been product vendors. So I was in-house at Symantec for many years. I worked at a law firm doing PR for them and kind of helping the partners advise clients that were dealing with data breaches, product vulnerabilities, export control issues. So I think what I find fun about my career and just this conversation we have today in general is there's always so many dimensions to cybersecurity just based on news. And then you've got the myriad creative ways to kind of be a storyteller and frame a lot of these dynamic issues for the audiences you're trying to reach.
I think it's safe to say that there's been dozens of Russo family dinners that have been ruined. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wouldn't have it any other way. Never a dull moment.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It seems from these intros, I think there's going to be so much knowledge in this session. I have my notebook and pen ready. Let's dive right in. Let me know when you're ready for the next slide.
Yeah, go for it.
Awesome.
Tom, why don't you kick us off?
Absolutely. So why are we so interested in media relations? I always love to kick off these kinds of conversations that way. The Greatest Showman plays frequently in my house, and this is my favorite PR quote from the movie. Your reputation precedes you, and well, I trust your reputation more than my own taste. And I always think this speaks really well to what we talk about with media relations, earned media. We're trying to form reputations for companies. We're trying to get that intangible storyline that's out there, and it makes the audience think, I've heard of these folks before. I've seen them. I've seen someone from that company quoted. I saw an interesting opinion, an interesting data set. Maybe I saw a talking head on TV or at an event. So this is really the important credibility building aspect of what we do when we talk about media relations, is building that kind of bond around a topic, a subject, a breaking issue with the audience. And it's all about reputation. And so whenever I hear this, I always tell people in the audience, hey, this is a great PR teachable moment. And then they just tell me to get out of the room. Next slide. Quick pivot off that. This is also what I love to talk about whenever I'm sitting down with marketers, founders, entrepreneurs, anyone in these kinds of sessions. Is I always like to personally put earned media in context, because a lot of us are really busy communicators, and we're focusing on all these spheres. This is the typical kind of peso model. You've probably seen this. It's blogged about frequently in the marketing community, public relations community. So from a media perspective, we talk about paid, earned, shared, owned. And some of this you control with direct spend, right? Certainly advertising, owned media. You can do a lot of things with search engines, buying billboards, put an ad on a bus. You can do a lot of that from an earned from a paid and owned standpoint. Shared is going to be your social play, and it's earned media where we drew that rectangle. That's what we're talking about today. And these are things that you can't buy transactionally. You can't really control this. This is about relationship building to nail that sphere. And I happen to like this kind of diagram because it shows some of the overlapping areas where if you have colleagues that work in these areas, or if you are responsible for all these areas, as many people are, you can find some neat ways to leverage what you're already doing and turn it into assets and things that can work from an earned media, a media relations perspective. So I think this is, I mean, back in the office where I haven't been for a year, this is what I have on my wall, because I literally can point to it when we're on a call about a byline or a webinar or a speaking event. And I can say, look, this will fit nicely into some of these things that were working for you. And ideally for clients, we like to orchestrate all of this so we can help drive the alignment and make sure that no effort goes wasted. You can click along. This is a good example of the difference to me between paid, owned, and earned. So when we're doing a paid media campaign, we're writing top of funnel content that's going to be for a paid LinkedIn campaign, or it's going to be a piece of sponsored content, something for like a public sector trade audience or an energy trade audience, we're in the speedboat. It's just gas and go. We can place that content by buying that space, writing that material, and there's no editor to approve it. It goes independent of news cycles. We just go. Conversely, on the right-hand side, when you're talking earned media, this is the relationship building, the hearts and minds with reporters, the credibility campaigns. What do we have to say about an issue? You're never just pitching. You're always going against what I call the winds and the currents that are prevailing around you. So with a sailboat, unlike a speedboat, if you want to go straight, you kind of have to steer right? You have to deal with the winds and the currents, and that's current events, things in the news, rapid response. Can I help a reporter with something so I can build some credibility before they will really kind of be in a position to entertain my story pitch? And so these are very, very different worlds. And I've met a lot of, again, founders, investors, others. Sometimes they conflate these and they just say, hey, it's a blog post, get us coverage. And, it's different. You can't just drag and drop things that work for paid owned into the earned media sailing diagram. I couldn't resist this. Any of us who are just trying to chart a course to the Wall Street Journal, the solar winds are blowing, breaking, a baby monitor was hacked. And these things are what suck all the oxygen out of the room in a news cycle and might swamp you. So just be advised. I think anytime we're taking a really enterprising, creative campaign out of the gate, we're excited, we're heads down, we've got the right media list, and you'll see in some of these other slides kind of how we formulaically build this for clients. But you never know what you're going to face. As we all know, someone could tweet, there could be a breach, geopolitical thing, solar winds, or I've heard these baby monitors get hacked, and broadcast loves it. This is the kind of stuff that you have to be prepared when you make your battle plans and advise your stakeholders. We're just going to be agile. Some stuff may come up in the news, and the expert that we have prepared to talk about this may not be the baby monitor expert, but if that's what they come to you in the green room and say, hey, this happened, can you talk about it? Be prepared, because that could be an opportunity to just nuance what you're prepared to say and put it in that consumer electronics context.
I would say too, it's like when executing a media relations strategy, so much of it just has to be pivoted, or you have to be agile. I think that's one thing that the instructors for last week's course mentioned. It's like we had to pivot so often in 2020, and I think to Tom's point, it's like it's a very indirect path sometimes, but that's the beauty of it, and that's the fun in it at the same time. This is a fun slide. I think this one, I'll just kick it off. It just shows how crowded the space is. And as I'm
Did we lose her? Is it us or just her?
I think Christine may have had a freeze there.
Question that I ask in all the podcast episodes.
Christine, you froze for a second there. You were just kicking off how crowded this slide is.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. If I cut out again, Tom, just feel free to jump in. But I was just saying, one thing I ask on the podcast episodes to every reporter is, how do you recommend companies differentiate themselves in such a crowded and noisy space? And it's a loaded question, and it's a tough question, but it comes down to, being an expert in your area, bring something different to the table. I think so many times it's like an echo chamber, and people are just repeating things that others are saying, and it's really pushing products and solutions, but it's like, what can you be saying that really sets you apart, that's different? And I think the crowdedness of the space is definitely a challenge that we've been seeing.
Yeah, I always like to talk about this slide in terms of when something happens in the news, a big data breach, or when we're getting into the kind of outreach ground game plans for major events like RSA Conference, Black Hat USA. These are all the people pitching reporters, not just these people, but the PR agencies for all of them. All these companies are tweeting. They all contribute to this amazing crescendo of noise. And even a lot of journalists and analysts, others that have been following this sector for years, even they will often sometimes say, a lot of these companies sound the same. So, I talk about this not from an intimidation standpoint or kind of a negative standpoint. It's more just to kind of set the bar. Like, this is a very chaotic landscape. There's a lot going on. Things are very fluid, but it should be empowering. You have an opportunity to take a breath, step back, and figure out from a communications perspective, what are you articulating, leveraging your people, your technology, your vantage point, and your experience in the market. Always a good eye chart to reference.
Hey, that eye chart, do you have Palo Alto Networks on there anywhere?
Oh, that's a good question. This chart
since they're the largest cybersecurity freestanding company, thought they might be in a couple areas.
Yeah, I mean, I borrowed this from CB Insights. I mean, it's probably doubled in size since the start of this Zoom.
Oh, okay.
But
that's true.
It should be in here for sure. I mean, I think you've got some network play. I guess no, they don't have network in here now.
No, well, they have network and I was looking in upper right because network and endpoint security.
Yeah. Well, and the other interesting point is you've obviously got so much M&A in the sector. So companies kind of build a reputation and then they're acquired and someone creates a new platform. And I think that's a little bit of a challenge too, in terms of, cybersecurity is conditioned to integration and pulling these piece parts together. It's always a very fragmented space. And a lot of times that becomes the message. And from a journalist perspective, they're not necessarily interested in, kind of platforms and vision and putting pieces together. It's like, what are the use cases? What are the issues that you're solving? And oftentimes that's how they view this landscape versus an analyst, a vendor, people like us. We often like to conveniently carve it up in terms of what space are you in? And that's kind of just a whole different language than what a lot of the external publics follow.
So I think those slides really set the foundation for what we're talking about and talking about the actual execution. I know one of the bullet point takeaways that we wanted from this session is how to effectively media list and to pitch. So I would say that media lists are really the foundation to your announcement. Not even announcement, just proactive pitching, byline pitching, any of it. So I think you have to first start in determining who your target audience is. And build out your list from there. I think one of the most important things you can do is research your targets. I've heard literally every single reporter at some point say their biggest pet peeve is somebody just reaching out blindly without even knowing what they cover. And you'll see this with reporters on Twitter commenting on it. I hear it on the podcast all the time. It's like I get pitches about the most random things, and it's like, did this person even look at my body of work? Did they even understand what my beat is? So I think that's like, it seems obvious, but I hear it too often that I don't think it is sometimes. So I think it's super, super important to research, know their latest articles. I think when you're emailing a reporter, referencing an article that you thought was interesting, that you thought they made a good point on, like it's definitely appropriate to reference that article and say, hey, I saw you wrote about, the supply chain. I have this perspective on it. I want to, talk to you about this topic. Leveraging social media is really big. We actually have a slide on here with some examples from Twitter, but a lot of journalists use Twitter. I've seen them tweet about looking for resources. I've seen them talk about, what they're covering, big stories, breaking news, all of it. And then I also think it's really valuable to engage with them on social media as well. So if you see an article that, if you're trying to get in touch with somebody at Reuters and you see them tweeting their article, and I mean, why not hit like the heart on it, right? And why not retweet it? The more they see your name coming up as someone that actively engages with their articles, the more they're going to recognize you when you either DM them or when you email them. So I think just starting there, it's like not always going after a reporter when you need something from them. It's like, how can you have a mutual beneficial relationship where you also engage and retweet their work and engage with their work? And then it kind of sets you up for a great relationship building engagement.
Yeah. A couple of things I would add to this. Christine made some great points. Is like a lot of times this can feel intimidating. Like, well, which reporters do I follow? How do I build this list? I often get the question, how long should my list be to be effective? And those are great questions. And like the length of a list, for example, we all know is really important when you're doing things like, again, sales, outbound prospecting. Like you don't want to send a really important piece of collateral to 5 prospects. Whereas on the earned media front with media relations, a shorter list is okay if it's focused. And I always like to kind of draw the diagram of let's capture the local media. Let's capture people that are, in your, where your headquarters and key facilities are, because they're important. They're going to want to cover announcements, facilities, funding, that sort of thing. but you also want to take stock of, who's covering your 2 or 3 peer competitors, who's big in the industry sectors that are kind of make or break for your company, whether that's government or energy. Hector is here asking a question about, podcasts. Absolutely. You want some outlets in there that could be good kind of storytelling opportunities for you. So where can we have kind of unpacked conversations about what we're seeing, what we're doing? So I think if you create a list and you kind of organize it along those tabs, along those components, you'll have a pretty good group to work with. And you definitely want to tune that as you go. There are always great intangibles that could make a lot of sense for you. For example, maybe there's someone that writes for a trade association, like a pharma trade association, and your salespeople, your engineers tell you that we're ideal for this pain point in the pharmaceutical industry. That trade journal reporter or writer could end up being one of your most important media contacts in terms of leads resulting from media coverage, kinetic action resulting from media coverage. So I think it's always great to start with a good formula and just not be afraid to add as you go along, as different things filter across your desk.
Mm-hmm. And I too would say it's really important to personalize your emails. Sometimes we get intimidated by, select reporters at times, and it's just knowing that they're human too. You don't have to be super robotic with your sentence structure or anything like that. It's just knowing like, hey, how are you doing? I think just having that human interaction helps build that relationship as well. And that kind of goes to the point about don't copy and paste emails. Sometimes if you are sending kind of a bigger announcement out, you may send it to several different people. And, if certain reporters are comparing even like pitches that they got, it could be pretty awkward if they're like, oh, I got the same exact email, or it's not personalized enough, where it just seems like a little bit of lack of effort and lack of engagement in that way.
I have a question on the email part. What is y'all takes on not sending a press release in Newswire, but just sending it to a select few email media list, and just going that route versus sort of casting the wider net via the Newswire?
That's a great question. I've got one quick thought, and Christine can probably jump in as well. From a Newswire perspective, we often hear that question a lot, and I think the value and the role of newswires has been changing for a while, and never more so than today. I think there's a certain expectation, earnings announcements, big things like that. They look right on a newswire. Business Wire puts that out there, and there's a certain kind of prominence that just comes from that. But in terms of what does the Newswire get you in terms of earned media coverage, I would say, unless you're a large company and there's a lot of people on your beat covering your earnings every quarter, you're probably not going to get that much direct earned media results from a Newswire. Now, there are things you can do that are very impactful, like you can embed video in that press release. You can use a number of these different wire services, not just Business Wire. They give you functionality to add graphics, again, multimedia. So they're kind of great for just SEO, general awareness. But again, that's kind of back to the peso model. That's distinctly different from, is it going to get journalists to write? And that's a specific question that we know a lot of our clients, investors, executives ask. And so I think in terms of what's the best vehicle for news, wire services have some great capabilities for sure. But I think, it's that individual tailored outreach to your key reporters that is typically going to carry a lot more water. And also kind of taking a step back and thinking like, there's really not a formula for number of press releases or formula of press releases. You can announce things as blog posts. I think we're always advocates for saying, we want to have a good cadence of press releases so that part of our website isn't going dark necessarily, but it doesn't have to be, okay, we have to issue a press release because we've set a quota of issuing 6 a week. We can use some of these as blog posts. We can use social channels, and journalists are going to be more interested in that kind of tailored outreach to them versus what a company treats as a press release versus blog post or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tom, I think you hit that really well. I would say, I've seen companies do press releases on the wire solely for SEO purposes. And it's something that will be covered in next week's session on just content amplification. But I would agree that it's that tailored approach that really is what gets reporters to write. But it often doesn't hurt to put something out over the Newswire. I just wouldn't put all your eggs into that basket.
Mm-hmm. I see there was a question here about exclusives. from Kevin, which we allude to here. I think when you think about exclusives, which means giving a reporter like literally the first crack at a story. So we're going to reach out to a journalist and let she or he break this news. Those are really important from a relationship building perspective, especially if it's something that pertains to what they write about and they really see value and kind of the privilege of you giving them a first look at something. And typically it's more than just, hey, here's my news, cover it. It's kind of like, hey, here's what we're seeing and we're about to take this out. We'd like to work with you, journalists, to understand what kind of context could you apply around this? Could we work this into something that you're working on? We can provide a wedge of insight and we'd like to, kind of add it to the, pie that you're building out. And in those kind of conversations, there's usually some good interviews. You can brief them. They may ask you to comment on other things they're hearing, and then you just agree to that exclusive. Different than that is like an embargoed situation where you would take a piece of news out to multiple journalists and say, look, you cover defense aerospace. We're announcing this big customer win with, BAE or Boeing. I wanted to make sure you had this information again at the same time so you could ask us questions and prepare a story. And so that's likewise great for relationships, but again, it's very different because with an exclusive, you're giving it to one person. So I think these are helpful tactics to use from a relationship building standpoint. When you do have impactful news, always good to consider, do we want to pre-pitch it in some fashion like that versus just mechanically drop it out on our site?
I have a follow-up on the exclusive front. What's best practice in terms of timing? Because it's really tricky giving the exclusive to just one person and hoping that they take it, but then missing out on actually getting other people involved, right? Pre-launch. And so how do you time it right? So that way, even if that person that you thought to give the exclusive to says no, or is, crickets, then you kind of have your plan B.
You want to take that, Christine?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I love the topic of like embargo versus exclusive. I tend to gravitate more toward the embargo pitching side of the house. But I would say, typically when constructing, I'm just going to start like kind of further back. So when thinking about a media relations execution strategy, I think often we like to kind of make a literal calendar timeline. So it's like, okay, so you have research going out on February 5th. And we'll work back from that. So we typically like to make that target media list, identify if you want to go exclusive or embargo outreach. And then I would say you want to start seeding that exclusive a couple weeks in advance. I would say a good solid 2 weeks in advance to see if they have questions, because typically you'll want to conduct an interview ahead of time. You'll want to facilitate any questions they have, sort of help them craft that story. And also if they don't agree to the exclusive, go a different route. So if you try pitching an exclusive to the New York Times or something, they say no, then you can kind of pivot and say, all right, we're going to go the embargo approach with 5 different business press reporters and see who bites on that. So I would say, Marie, you want to definitely work at least 2 weeks in advance when it comes to any type of advanced pitching outreach. Tom, anything to add on that?
The only thing I would just quickly add is it's perfectly fair to put some soft time constraints on these journalists too in the course of outreach. So oftentimes when you're doing an exclusive, it's like, hey, we plan to issue this in the next week or so. What do you think? We're happy to adjust timing based on your schedule if you're interested in this exclusive. And so that way you've tactfully and very fairly set the expectation with them. Let me know if you're interested. If you are, fantastic. If you're not, it's understood. You're going to move on and perhaps reach out to a different outlet or take it elsewhere. The biggest thing I would recommend is just be forthright, be transparent, close the loop. Again, everyone's inundated. They can't always answer a call, text, or an email. Oftentimes I'll just put it in writing and shoot them a note. Hey, I know we touched base on this. It's been a couple of weeks. We're going to move on. Look forward to keeping in touch, and that way, they won't feel blindsided when they see the story in a rival publication or something else like that. Yeah, this is a fun slide. I know there's a lot of, this is like the actual meat of outreach. So definitely a lot of ground to cover here. I see a question here on just relationship building. I think one of the most effective things to do is to just, again, be conscious of not burning reporters out. So you want to make sure you're not cranking out emails, outreach calls to the same people in a very short span of time. That's one of the reasons that we're big advocates of taking, back to my description of that media list with those different tabs, taking a diversified approach to it. Because if you think about it, some of the mainstream business press reporters, you should be, I argue, the most sparing with them, because realistically, you're probably not going to have a lot of breaking news or research that pertains to their audience. Whereas, as we all know, the people that write for vertical publications, cybersecurity publications, they're more interested in some of these granular day-to-day issues. I cover security for public sector. So one day it's CMMC, the next day it's this other issue, then it's this, and then it's solar winds. And so they're more conditioned to wanting different vantage points on a slightly more frequent tempo about more specific things. So you just want to make sure that you're being judicious in terms of what are you offering people, and when. And trust me, I always feel like from talking with journalists, and I certainly hear this on Christine's podcast, they understand that if they intuitively realize, hey, whenever Maria reaches out to me, it's usually pretty interesting. It's usually on target. You'll start to rise above the other people in their inbox that are just inundating them with like RSS feed style pitch after pitch after pitch.
That's a really good point too, because I think another way to look at that is one of the best feelings is when it kind of turns around and then you find reporters start reaching out to you and they're like, oh yeah, so Stephanie kept coming to me with all these great resources, and now as a reporter, I want to now reach out to her to see if she can give me that person again. So I think that's a fantastic conversion to inbound requests. And I can give an example of something that happened recently, actually, with Steve Zurier at SC Media. He's someone that we work with often. And he actually reached out to me a couple of weeks ago looking for someone in the IP, an IP lawyer. And we didn't necessarily have like someone like I personally, actually, from clients I work with, did not have anybody available, but I wanted to help him out in good faith and to keep that relationship going and to have that strong trust and credibility. So I reached out to colleagues, peers, has anyone have a resource for him? And we were able to set him up with somebody that was a really solid fit and get them placed and interviewed and placed in the article he was writing. So I think examples like that, that didn't necessarily benefit me personally 100%, but I was able to help him out at the same time. And I think that goes to Erica's question about maintaining and building that trust and credibility. So we have another question here. Is it worthy to contribute with them with maybe cyber light articles for those times when you don't have content to push from your company?
We have a slide on content later in this deck. I think we could probably illustrate that question nicely, Hector.
Yeah, let me go to the next slide, Maria, because I think there's a bit on social media. So as I mentioned earlier, it's social media and journalists kind of go hand in hand, especially these days. We see a lot of reporters on Twitter. So these are some examples of tweets that you don't want to be about you. We always joke that Tom collects these for his coffee table book on media relations that doesn't work. So I'll let him speak to this one a bit.
No. Christine finds more of these than I do.
I put it down like, this is for your book, Tom.
And the journalists on our podcast certainly say this live, but I mean, this is literally kind of, just look at this and tap the brakes if you need to, because this is a good raw example of how much pressure these journalists are under. And when you're pitching them something that is just off topic, and I realize that's a subjective label, but you just want to consider the timing and the gravity of what you have. So just in a nutshell, these are three journalists that we work with pretty frequently. And so here you can see on election day, Tanya Riley, who writes the Cybersecurity 202 for the Washington Post, why is someone pitching her a consumer product on election day, right around the election, right? It just doesn't make any sense. Chris Bing, who we've worked with back since he started writing for, DCNO, before he went to Reuters and has broken many screenplay-worthy stories. He's complaining about just COVID, everybody glomming onto COVID and stapling it onto their pitches. And then Kim Zetter here raises a really good point that I'm passionate about. The point she raises here, it's back to the peso model. she's just calling out, like, why isn't there media contact info on your website? Which is a great question. And this is a classic case of where people like us, communicators, need to be engaged with the people that run our company's sites, because if there's not information there for media, least of all contact information, you're doing yourself a huge media relations disservice right out of the gate. So I think these are always good. You should always be following the reporters that are in your key audiences. And so when you look at what they're tweeting, Twitter is a double-edged sword, I think, but one of the positive things is it does give you a snippet into what they're complaining about, what they're writing on, what their thoughts are. Are they having a good or bad day? I mean, it's all public. You can kind of look at that and get a sense for, oh wow, should I lie low? Or hey, they just said something really interesting on Twitter that pertains to what one of my threat researchers or my CEO has been talking about. I'm gonna reach out and mention the tweet. I mean, it just shows them that you're paying attention and you're trying to be nuanced.
Mm-hmm. I would say the biggest kind of takeaway for everyone listening is that don't, just be cognizant of what's going on in the world and the news when you're sending out pitches, right? Like this year it's just been insane in terms of like every day was a different news story. And we even advise clients, hey, like in this 2-week period, like it's best not to do any announcements. It's best not to pitch anything out because it'll come across tone deaf. As Tony and Joyce talked about last week, it's like there is a time and a place, and sometimes it may be better just to be quiet and not worry about your product or your research or anything like that.
Christine makes a great point there real quickly, and I'll let us jump to the next slide. But what she said reminded me of that in the past calendar year, we've had just incredible, challenging, to use the trite word, unprecedented counsel to clients for all the past year's calamities. The pandemic, the social justice movements and Black Lives Matter and the urban protests and all of these, and then you had the election. All of these things have been really important. I mean, literally, safety, life, death, future of the country, what happened on January 6th. They have been monumentally impactful things, and we've given a lot of counsel in how to try and steer around them, and definitely pivot. I mean, many of our clients embraced these, talked about how they were supporting their employees, the liberties and support they were giving them. But it did pose challenges for, we have to issue news, we have announcements, we have events, we have things that we have to push forward as communicators. So, never be afraid if your gut tells you that this might look tone deaf or it might look inopportune. Never be afraid to pull that ball back and get with your team, get with your client, get with your internal stakeholders and say, look, as a communicator, I have some concerns about this, and let's revisit how we're staging this or what our timeline and expectations are, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about, building a media list, when to pitch, when not to pitch, all that foundational stuff. And this next slide here is about what to actually include in your outreach emails. I think important first to identify your audience, who you want to reach, and when you're crafting that email, what type of storyline do you want to get across? Identifying your spokespeople who. This goes across all different types of things, but in your pitch, like who is going to be your spokesperson talking to the reporter? You want to make sure that you have someone that represents that thought leadership angle, not someone on the sales team, right? Like someone who's able to speak from a higher level, putting things into more context. And then the third bullet on content and insights, the actual crux of the pitch is discovering that storyline. So oftentimes we'll find contrarian viewpoints resonate well. It's something that's a little bit different, right? We always hear reporters saying, hey, we hear the same thing over and over again. So what do you have to say that's different? So contrarian viewpoints, and then what is the data that you have to back it up? I think anytime you're pitching research, obviously, or pitching just any sort of proactive topic, what qualifies you and your spokesperson to share this information? That content and that crux of the pitch. I find it very useful, and I think reporters do too, when you even bullet these things out. Like, okay, it's almost like that when you're looking at the actual way that the pitch is written. It's like, okay, you have your main storyline, your main point, you have the spokesperson that will talk about it, and then bullet what they actually will talk about. And maybe those are data points, but they're quick snapshots that when anyone pulls up the email, they'll be able to see what it is that they're getting into. So I think that I always kind of recommend that bullet point approach, or even if you're using paragraphs, short and concise paragraphs of what, what this pitch is about and what the story is about, or the announcement's about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I would add to this is down at the bottom, make quality over quantity a forcing function. Lots of people say quality over quantity, and it's kind of a cliche. It can mean different things. But when I think about media relations, I always say an organization is going to be better served with a small number of deep, substantive, focused outreach campaigns, as opposed to a big arsenal of 15 current events driven, keyword driven, buzzword driven campaigns that we're just going to carpet bomb from 30,000 feet. You're always going to be more effective and gain more respect and credibility when you're taking that really surgical treetop level approach, where you're going after the right reporters with the right story on things that you can talk about. In every sense, it doesn't have to be pegged to your technology or an industry sector you're following. It can be something your management team is passionate about. It can be something you're doing interesting internally with employees, right? Like, that has to be informed by what your audience and your objectives are. And that's kind of the secret sauce. But in principle, it should be really nuanced and targeted. And that kind of frees you up, right? Now you can go to your management team and others and say, look, we're focusing on what works here in our communication shop. And I may hear from different people in the organization, sales, legal, government relations. This was my world at Symantec, right? Guys, we have to be out in front of all these issues. Okay, that's true, but there's only so many hours in the day. So we need to stack rank what are the priorities and build these things out. And bear in mind, again, this is earned media relations. It takes time, right? You don't boil the ocean. So this last bullet here, when I was at Symantec, we would be out at RSA conference, and the salespeople would say, well, Tom, there's a lot of journalists here. How many stories are you going to get for us? And I would say, well, there's a lot of CISOs here too. How many enterprise level agreements are you going to sell today, right? How many ELAs are you going to bag? And they would get angry and walk away. And it's like, of course, you don't bag that on the first pass. It takes time, hearts and minds, people. So a lot of this, I think, is liberating in terms of what are we doing to have really smart, conducive pitches, and we're going to put them in the water, and we're going to just, again, let it ride, focus, be real.
I have a follow-up on that. Who in the company would you say is, or maybe the top 3 spokespeople that we should use in these types of pitches? Across product or solutions architects, or which ones?
That's a great question. I think historically it's usually kind of your CEO, COO for business press. People gravitate towards CTOs, chief architects for like the technical, again, like the deeper dive technical trade press or issues. And then we've all seen scores and scores of researchers or on-site consultants talking about kind of gritty cybersecurity findings or issues in the trenches. That all works, but I don't think you necessarily need to be beholden to that. I mean, it's kind of funny, for better or worse, people with sales in their title tend to not get a lot of credibility from media. It's not fair to those people because they have tremendous insights, but I understand where journalists are coming from. That's just kind of an optics issue with the title. In my career, when I started, you could deputize those people with separate titles for media. Today in the era of LinkedIn, social media, you can't do that because someone's going to be discovered, outed as a salesperson. But we actually take it on as a charge with our clients, where we're always looking to get more spokespeople introduced if they have something to say. Like SEs, for example, can be fantastic resources because, again, they're in the trenches, they're seeing the customer pain points. So you can certainly just take a step back, and you don't have to jump into the traditional lanes. I mean, clearly, those people that I mentioned, those categories of people, I think they should be trained up and they should be prepared to step into those functions. But you certainly don't need to limit yourself to them if you've got someone in the company you think could be a really good point of view.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, I've used a lot of VP of Threat Intelligence research labels. I think people with those titles are often requested by journalists because they are in the trenches. Another point I want to make is an interesting one. I think think about the spokespeople's backgrounds. Some publications, I'm thinking of SC Magazine, CyberWire, and others, they'll dedicate certain months to women in security. So I think if you have, different people with different types of backgrounds, right? Like think about the women leaders at your company and leveraging them, for these opportunities and others. I think that's always a good way to look at it too, and just be mindful of those types of opportunities and how that could be perceived as well.
That is a great point. Really great point. I know one of the things we're all seeing is that, and it's kind of funny, it's I would put it up there with SolarWinds and the baby monitor, but it's the hashtag talent shortage is a thing in cybersecurity. I think we're all waiting to see if there will ever be a talent surplus, probably never. But that talent shortage continues to be a big oxygen sucking storyline. And I think you can use it to your advantage when you talk about reflecting the different roles and backgrounds of people, as Christine said, in your company. I worked with a client a few years ago where, one of the consultants in the company, she was basically in charge of going on site and making sure the systems were compliant, risk was being addressed. She started out her career in emergency medicine as a paramedic. And so her path into compliance and cyber risk was fun and fascinating. And it's kind of funny, of course, she was so close to her story, it didn't dawn on her. She's like, well, I haven't found any APT groups. I don't have any patents. I wasn't an NSA, TAO operator. And we had a lot of fun just unpacking her story. It was fascinating. And to her credit, she accomplished so much from such an interesting background, and her kind of diverse career experience lent her to jumping in the fray, solving problems, connecting dots, diagnosing things. And so again, you have to kind of take a fresh look at who's in your organization and where can they bring those kinds of insights to bear, for sure.
And this
I just want to do like a quick time check.
Yeah.
Christine, do you think we'll be able to cover the rest in the next 12, 15 minutes or so?
Yeah, I think we can pass on this one.
There.
I think we covered this one and a lot of the things. If anyone has any specific questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I think if we move to the next one, we can go into some content.
Okay, great.
Blogs and bylines piece of everything. Perfect. Yeah, so the power of content development applied to earned media. This is a humongous aspect of executing a media relations strategy. As we say here at the top, guest blogs and columns are one of the fastest ways to control your message. Sometimes when you send out a media pitch, the editor can be like, hey, no, I'm not interested in an interview, but do you have time to write an article on it? And that is that's always a welcome ask, because it's a way that you as a company can pull together 800 words of a thought leadership message, not being self-serving, to really tell the story that you want to tell and control that message.
Yeah, and there was a question asked earlier, I think by Hector, that referenced content and like working with reporters. And maybe I misunderstood the question, but I think it pertained to like, what can you put out there to maybe help them in between stories? And this is a huge opportunity today. I think when you look at the media industry, there are a lot fewer reporters to cover more breaking news, and that kind of lends to the stress and the pressure, per those tweets earlier. But there are growing opportunities for organizations to submit, vendor neutral contributed content, guest blogs, guest articles, bylines, they're called different things. But that's an especially important aspect of the vertical media world. So if any of you focus on financial services, energy, government, those kinds of publications, they want that content. If it's substantive, it's not pitching product. It's taking those contrarian viewpoints. So a lot of the campaigns that we stand up and take out to media, any given day, news cycles are insane. Some of them will land on their feet. Some of them will click. Some of them may get put kind of on the side burner, and the journalist says, let me get some things off my desk and I'll come back to that. But oftentimes, they're also great topics for this contributed content play as well. So you can kind of move the chains, if you will, by getting some of these pieces published in earned media outlets. And it's great. It helps drive the program forward. And it also puts you out there in print so that when people are Googling you, journalists are looking for more background, they come across your words verbatim and they say, oh, that's an interesting way. And now I see how someone diagnoses that issue.
Mm-hmm. So oftentimes when we kick off with a client, we recommend this approach first, even before the proactive pitching, because like Tom said, it gives a place for when other reporters are, Googling the company name or the spokesperson, they're directed back to this article that they've already written. So it develops that really strong body of work, and that you can build on that foundation. So we often want to tee up several content byline opportunities first, ahead of time, ahead of that media pitching, so that you really have that strong foundation to build upon. Some things that are important to be successful in this endeavor is, I think the most important one is to be vendor neutral and tailored. I've seen, quite a few article topics get turned away and rejected because they are self-serving. And even if you don't think it is, and there's like a little bit of it in there, the editor will find it. So I'm going to give the example. Dark reading actually is pretty strict with their policy, and they actually refer to it as the hamburger analogy. And Tom, jump in if I say this wrong, but basically, it's like, imagine McDonald's pitching or writing an article, and they don't talk about, their restaurant, but they refer to a hamburger. Indirectly, they're being self-serving to their product. So you want to take away any references to the hamburger in your article. There's still ways to show that you're the expert and that, you have great thought leadership on this topic. But if they smell any of that, marketing lingo or anything to do with your product or solution, there's a chance it will get rejected. So just keep in mind that you should be really careful about that. And different publications have a different tolerance for it. I think some of those top tier publications, like for content that is like top tier tech trades like SC Media, Dark Reading, they are a little bit more strict than others, but just something to keep in mind.
Can I ask a question about that? I mean, that always, I don't know, PR just always sometimes just makes me smile. It's the only thing that can, because obviously it's about getting recognition for the company you represent, but you're not to be self-serving. It's just, I don't know. I think it's a game.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good point that you raised there. I think, and we've all seen this, right? Like, personally, I know some editors that are very strict on that vendor neutrality rule, and I'll read an article that's like, wow, interesting. Mice are a problem, says Mousetrap Vendor. And so it's like, okay, that came awful close to the line. We know that happens. I mean, this, everything's fluid. But I would agree that you can make it a little less transparent and a little more substantive if you try to step back into these, how do we view problems today? How do we come at issues? Like, one of the most impactful bylines I think I ever saw written was one of our clients talked about, are you a capital C CISO or a lowercase c CISO? And so his point of view was all about, they're threatening to fire you if the company gets hacked, but do you have any real influence in the company, right? Here are 3 ways to tell. So, and sometimes, salespeople will say, well, that's great, but it doesn't talk about our solution. Well, it may not be able to talk about your solution because of vendor neutrality, but it gets you out there with some ideas. And even more importantly, it gets your spokespeople out there so that they can kind of gain followings and they can put it on their LinkedIn and Twitter. Again, back to that peso model, all this has to tie together. So whenever I'm getting badgered with questions about how is this alone going to get me an ELA, I always say it may or may not, but it's part of a broader campaign. And you should have those other paid, owned, right, other cylinders in the engine firing aligned to this, so that we're not just doing one, right? Ideally, we're not doing something one-off here. We're making it part of a broader story. So this topic I mentioned would be like the byline prong of this bigger campaign that we're focused on for Q4, or Q3, or whatever it is. Hope that's helpful. I know we've got some metrics, and then this is our last slide, I think, so we can definitely jump on some questions. I'll just to kind of quickly hit this slide. I think we get a lot of questions about metrics, and maybe that's the best Q&A, because we're going to have, I know, a lot of questions about what you measure, and I think no two companies focus on metrics the same way. Historically in my career, I've always been, bludgeoned with that question, how is PR helping sales, right? Great way to frame the question. Not really. So it's always about, okay, how do we substantiate the work that we do? And up at the top, I think there are some good constructive things you can do that are definitely metrics, right? So, we always have that top 20 most important reporters for any company. So how are we doing with them? Who have we met with? Who do we still have to crack the ice with? Work on that. You can look at the number of campaigns. You can capture the feedback you get if someone says, hey, I'm meeting with your company because I saw that byline or I saw that news article. You can certainly count things like interviews and coverage, but don't forget at the bottom, a lot of this is fundamentally qualitative, right? We're back to hearts and minds. You can't put hearts and minds in Salesforce. So you have to be able to understand what's the vibe? How am I reading the room? What's the tone of that journalist during the interview? Am I getting through to them? And understand that all of this takes place against the backdrop of ridiculous news cycles. I said news cycles were crazy, during the blaster worm in 2003. That's, pastoral compared to how it is today. So always be confident in explaining, here's what we've achieved against this backdrop of chaos. Anything to
Yeah, no,
add, Christine?
I think that all makes sense. I think any questions coming up to the top of the hour, any questions anyone or topics anyone wants to discuss in particular?
I'd love to cover a little bit from your point of view, talking PR in general to leadership and to those that don't necessarily understand not only how PR works, but the kind of game PR is, right? The long-term game versus the short-term. And you covered this already in terms of what is it going to bring us in terms of revenue, but what are some best practices to not be rude, but just explain it all to leadership?
Tom, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. I am passionate about the long game. You never go wrong if you play the long game. And the more, if you think about it logically, the more insane news cycles are, the more you should be playing the long game and looking at it that way. Because as a communicator, if your client or internal stakeholders have resourced and supported you properly, you should be given license to play the long game as long as you have a plan and a strategy. And when that, tweet or whatever, or thing blows up the baby monitor, okay, down and past this, right? We always live to fight another day and be proactive and pivot off of that story and do things. And I always feel passionately when I hired PR agencies and direct reports on the in-house side, and here in my role now, I'm always passionate about put pressure on us, yes, to analyze that and act and pivot and give you situational updates and recommendations. Don't put pressure on us to, well, you failed if this story didn't happen on this time, on this day at 2:32 p.m., right? So you should always be playing the long game. And I think that's just a really good strategy, again, with earned media. There are very serious time constraints for those other spheres on the earlier slide, but earned media, you're never holding all the cards. And time is something you have to leverage, not view always as a negative.
And I think it goes back to the initial goals of the program too. It's like often we see clients and their goal is to increase awareness and credibility. So if you can measure all the things that you're doing back to that and communicate how the things that the program is doing, even though it is a long game, to build awareness and credibility, I think that goes really far, because it's not always super tangible, but you do see it. You can arm the salespeople with these articles and these examples and anecdotes. So I think a lot of it, while it can be intangible, I think a lot of it comes down to just raising that awareness. We had a client recently who a newer one, and they were in a meeting, and they said like they've been in this meeting before with a number of other peers in the industry, and previously they didn't really have much name recognition. But then as of the latest meeting, they had a significant, like everyone knew who they were now, right? And that's not something like super tangible. It's not like because of this article, 50 people now know who we are, but they had awareness from their peers in the industry as a competitor. So I think that sort of intangible thing is something to look for and to promote internally within your organization.
Absolutely. Any other questions about anything else we covered here?
I might have one last question. I'm getting my money's worth from this session, let me tell you.
We might have had more time if I hadn't talked about the greatest show.
One last question, I promise, and then we can wrap it up. When you're building a PR strategy, let's say we have nothing, clean slate. How far do you go in terms of timing? Do you plan only for the first few quarters and then see how it goes and then plan for the rest of the year, or is it more long term?
Mhm. I mean, it can depend. I think I see a lot of success sort of doing like 6 months. So I've had I've seen clients plan out like an entire year, quarter by quarter, but it's so hard to tell. It's like based on your announcement pipeline. If you have an idea of those things that aren't changing throughout the year, that's fine. But I think taking it like 6 months, seeing what happens in those first 2 quarters, having your announcements, marketing initiatives that aren't changing plugged in, and then building around those is a good, healthy way to do it.
Mhm. I would agree, and I think obviously it kind of depends on your situation, different size companies, how big your team is, of course. But I think one good kind of rule of thumb is it's often hard to plan on a quarter by quarter basis. I'm sorry, it's often hard to plan further than a quarter by quarter basis, just because so much changes in the organization. But there are some good things you always want to be focused on, and that's kind of the media training. Who are my spokespeople? Just kind of keeping that in your eyes too, because you want to factor for things like we're an expanding company, and I want a more diverse and reflective spokesperson team, people that can speak from all organizations of our culture, our technology. You want to have an eye towards things like B-roll. Can we shoot some footage to keep around? Can we do some videos so that we have those kind of richer things to offer journalists? So those tend to be just things that you want to kind of keep your eye on, kind of as a sidebar, build up that content inventory, because those are going to be good evergreen items, versus that quarterly plan is typically more driven by, what's our roadmap? What are the key virtual conferences coming up that we're at? We have to have air cover for this new partnership. So can we get someone from their side to help us collaborate on PR? That's, to me, is kind of the difference I draw between, good ongoing things we want to be creative about versus, okay, with those in mind, we have to hit these objectives. And so this is going to be the bones of our quarterly plan.
Makes sense. Evergreen content. I like that. I always forget to remember those. Perfect. Anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, we can wrap it up. And then now I can't wait for course number 3. Thank you all so much for joining us on a Friday.
Thanks, everybody.
Love seeing all of your faces as always. And yeah, we'll see you next Friday. Thank you so much. Thanks, W2 team.
Yeah.
Amazing,
Thanks,
as
W2.
usual.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, everyone. Give us feedback. Reach out anytime.
Will do.
Great. Bye.
All right.